And we'll look at how momentum is being built and created at the local, state, and federal levels. So moderating this conversation is one of my favorite journalists, Deena Shanker, who is with Bloomberg. She will be joined by MacKenzie, the executive director of the New York City Mayor's Office of Food Policy, Sophia Hosain, the Zero Waste Manager at the Baltimore City Department of Public Works, Emily Leib, a clinical professor of law and the founding director of the Harvard Law School Food Law and Policy Clinic, and Madeline Keating, a senior advocate on food waste for NRDC. And I'm going to get out of the way. Give them a round of applause.
Thank you so much for having us. And let me just say that as a middle child, I love being referred to as a favorite anything. So thank you. So we are here to talk about food waste and food waste policies at federal, state, and local levels. And I actually wanted to start with a study that recently came out. Emily, of course, has read the study and is ready to talk about it in depth. So I was hoping, Emily, you could tell us a little bit about what this study found. It looked at landfill bans across the country. So tell us a little bit about what these landfill bans are and then what these researchers found.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Deena. Thank you to NRDC and Food Tank. I'm so excited. So we, in my organization, we do a lot of work really helping people understand the laws around food waste, but also the food system more broadly, and then think about policy change. So one of the ways we've been doing this in terms of food waste has been for years now tracking the evolution of policies at the federal level and looking at what states are doing. I know this is a little bit of buildup, but one of the exciting things has been a number of states have been enacting what we've been calling food waste deterrence policies. So these include either a ban on food going into the landfill, a tax or other penalty on excess food being wasted, donation requirements that penalize food businesses for not donating safe, edible food. And it's been really incredible to see. The first state that enacted ones was really 2012. Massachusetts, Vermont were some of the first states. And now we're seeing more than 11 states have these kinds of policies. So this study that just came out was the first one that really tried to compare across states to see what they look like. And what it found was Massachusetts, which I'm not surprised by because Massachusetts has a great policy, was extremely effective. And they saw that there was in, I think just the first, 5 years since that policy was in place, 13% reduction in food waste. And you just heard a little bit about how food waste is a huge emitter. There was a 25% reduction in emissions per ton in the landfill because the things in the landfill were no longer food, it was other things, and therefore we saw a big reduction in emissions. And it also found that states that had much weaker policies didn't see as much change. So I think it's a real call to action for us to help support states doing things like this and making sure that when they implement these, they, put teeth in them and really make sure that they're following through.
Can you give us an example of what a weak policy is versus a good, strong one?
Yes, I'd be delighted to. So I think what we're seeing, there's these policies will vary on a couple different ways. Sometimes the weak ones will have a really high threshold. So Massachusetts is a good example. The way that the policy worked at the time the study was done was any producer that had more than a ton of food waste per week going to landfill was going to be penalized. So it was really the biggest businesses. And even since that study came out, Massachusetts has half that. And now they say if you have a half a ton of food waste going to the landfill per week, you'll be penalized. So a lot of businesses are being impacted. A weak state would be one that says, if you have 2 tons of food waste per week, are you subject to the ban? That is a lot of food being wasted. So it's only a handful of businesses, or a number of states have exemptions from the ban if you're not within a certain number of miles of a composting or anaerobic digestion facility. And in some of those states, it's if you're not within 10 or 15 miles of such a facility, you're not subject to the ban. Massachusetts, by contrast, said there's no exemptions. We want to force the building of more infrastructure. We want to have more composting and AD facilities, more food rescue. And they've actually seen that happen too. Not only did Massachusetts reduce food waste, but they saw an increase in donation. They saw the creation of 500 new jobs in food recovery and compost and AD. And again, this was, old data. It's probably even more now. 175 million in new revenue generated just by treating food as a resource instead of throwing it away in just 2 years of that ban.
So what do you think, can other states model themselves on this ban and use these specifics? Is it possible to change bans that are already in place to make them more effective?
Yeah, definitely. I think, so at the time that study was done, they looked at 5 states, including Massachusetts, one of which was California, which at that time had a very weak law and had just enacted a legislation, SB 1383, which since has been implemented and is much stronger in terms of like requiring food to not go into landfill and actually requiring donation of edible food from a large number of businesses in the state. So it'd be interesting now to go back and like see what that looks like. But again, they had a policy, they realized it wasn't doing what they wanted, and they, really rallied behind doing a better job. And a number of the states that are out there have been increasing the strength of their policies over time. So I mentioned Massachusetts, like the threshold got lower. I think a lot of states have an opportunity to follow suit. And there are now 11 states that have these policies on the books and are in various steps of implementing them. But I would say like more resources, more funding. I think the federal government can bring in money to help support states doing this. You need to build infrastructure. You need to build the enforcement capacity. And that takes time and money. But I think we're on like a really good path. Like I'm excited about where we are, what the data is showing, and where we're going.
Great. Kate, I wanted to go to you next. For us New Yorkers, I feel like, probably a lot of people in this room follow much more closely than I do. But for me, I'm always like, what's the latest on the city's composting program? Because it feels like it changes a lot. And so I was hoping you could tell us sort of like about the evolution of of that program, where it is now, what challenges you guys faced, what successes you saw, and what lessons there are to take away from that.
Yeah, I'd love to. So composting in the city actually started in one form in 2017. And we never really had more than about 40% of the population utilizing the programs. Of course, during the pandemic, things shut down, they started to come back, then there were these budget cuts, but the fantastic news here is that as of October 6th, every residential household in New York City will have the opportunity for curbside compost pickup. Every household. So what that means is that we already are it's interesting. I was talking with Emily and earlier with Deena Gunders, and usually New York gets out ahead of and is really proud about these things, but we already have the nation's largest organics program. We had about 170 million tons of organics captured last year. And now with the curbside compost rollout, we also have 400 smart bins around the city. And those have seen an extraordinary amount of pickup over the recent 2 or 3 years as well. And so that's a lot about the residential side of things. I want to connect a little bit to what Emily was talking about. We also, for years, have been doing a waste characterization study to really, this is an important job to look at what we're collecting, how much what would be recyclable is actually being thrown away, how much organics is being thrown away. And what's interesting is that we have about 36% of all of our waste in New York City is organics. And then about just over 30% is recyclable. So the top line there means that 75% of the waste in New York City could be diverted from landfills. So that's our extraordinary opportunity. And so I encourage everyone, we are having education sessions because that I think is the hardest part for people to overcome. If you've been a lifelong composter, that's fantastic. Keep talking to people. If you're new to it, keep going with it. We're doing the best that we can to make it accessible by going to nyc.gov/DSNY to be able to get your brown bin. And it's a little less strict in what you are, maybe if you're composting for your backyard, what we're putting in. Certainly it's all yard waste and things like that, but you can even put meat and bones and that type of waste into your curbside composting. But then I also want to touch on schools. Because this is something that I'm particularly proud of, too, as a mother of 2 public school students. And I recently learned that my daughter's a lunch monitor. And she helps people, I hope helps is the right word, to separate what should be thrown away and what isn't. But, every school in the city has been trained at this point, right? So we all have been trained on many things, and whether or not we are as good at performing those actions is the great divide at times. So these are all behavior changes that we have the opportunity to practice. But I do know, and I also want to put a plug in for some of the work on the other side of my office that we're working on, which is around, I firmly believe in our schools, we will see less food waste because our food is especially delicious. And so we're really trying to make sure that by making sure that everything that we serve in school lunches and breakfast is kid approved, that we're like, kids genuinely want to eat the meals. And so that's helping to decrease food waste as well.
Got it. Great. Sophia, I'm curious what you, coming from Baltimore, when you look at, say, a city like New York, how much can you learn from city to city, and how much is like so city specific that you just have to find another way?
We take a lot of good lessons from New York, actually.
Same.
One interesting parallel is that about 75% of the waste generated in Baltimore City is also divertible in some way. So in terms of waste characterization, we're looking at something similar. We have about 100,000 tons per year generated in the residential sector of, food and yard waste. And when we think about how to divert it, like New York City, we are space limited, right? Like we can't build a 9-acre industrial composting facility in the city. And so we look at decentralized infrastructure. We look at, how can we put bins on the street where people can drop off their food waste? How can we make it convenient for people who don't drive, or, for people who are using public transportation? Or how can we utilize our urban farm network and use compost generation locally to support the food system, to support the farmers, to create the connection for people like, oh, the food waste that you put in this bin is actually being turned into compost to grow your food that you get at the farmer's market, right? It's like we have the opportunity to demonstrate how circularity actually works in a small footprint. So the other thing I love about New York is y'all are so good about, rat training. And like one of the biggest things with food waste is that there's the misunderstanding that composting or separating out your food scraps will exacerbate pest issues. And that's, I'm trying to debunk it, right? When you properly manage your wasted food, you're actually working to take away rats' food source, right? Take away those pest pressures. And so, y'all's rats are, I think I learned a lot from her. There's a lot of great parallels to draw, and just to, call on the last presenter talking about the funding opportunities from the EPA. Baltimore City received a Swiffer grant last year, and so we're going to be building the first in-city composting facility that'll be able to, at its current level of funding, process about a quarter of the food waste that's generated in the residential sector with opportunity to scale.
That's great.
Yeah. Now, I also, yeah. Maddie, I wanted to ask you a little bit about sort of what we see in food waste, which I think differentiates it from so many of the other issues in food, is that we always talk about systems change, but so much of the food waste, I think last I looked, it was like 48% comes from our homes. And I know there's been some public education campaigns around this from NRDC, but where should the focus be? Should it be on, obviously we'd like to have it everywhere, but but how much should we be focusing on what goes on in people's homes as difficult as it is to get people to change their kitchen practices, but also knowing that that's the bulk of the problem?
Yeah, that's a great question. So food waste is an issue that happens across the food supply chain, from farms to manufacturing to wholesalers to retail to restaurants and to households. NRDC works at the federal, state, and local level on policy interventions and different programs that can help to tackle food waste across the food supply chain. We were talking about this. Food waste as an issue is kind of like a bunch of different issues that are the product of a supply chain that is just not as efficient as it should be. And like other environmental issues, we have a obligation to address like what the root causes of that are. That said, there is a lot of food waste that's happening in our homes, and individuals can make a difference by reducing their own food waste. But we need to make it easy for them to do, and we need to make it something that is the norm. And so what I think we are dealing with as a root issue is an undervaluing of our food and a cultural component of just overconsumption without a focus on just basic behavior change that can happen in the household. Shopping with a list, organizing your fridge effectively, storing your food, understanding food date labels. This is a huge thing that we're trying to focus on at the federal level. So one of the things that Nina talked about just before this is a new grant announced by the EPA that we're really excited about, because what this is going to do is bring together a coalition of entities that are, of other things, going to be focusing on a campaign to reduce food loss and waste, specifically targeted ideally for consumers. And this is something that NRDC has a lot of background in. We have a campaign called Save the Food, and we work with a lot of local city governments to get Save the Food messaging implemented into their programming. So for example, if a city like New York City or Baltimore are rolling out a composting program, we want to ensure that there's messaging on that composting education program that says, eat your food before you compost it, because that's going to reduce your food. That's going to reduce the load on the city to process that food waste. And it's also going to keep money in the consumer's pocket. So a lot of money is wasted each year on food that isn't eaten. And so not only do we see this as an opportunity to address methane from landfills, address overworked waste management systems, but we also see it as an opportunity to keep money in consumers' pockets and help it be seen as an inroad to just being a more conscientious consumer.
So it's really interesting that you say that, because as I was doing my homework for today, I looked at the Refed Food Waste Monitor, and the latest year that they have is for 2022. And great news, food waste was down. Maybe people remember 2022, food inflation was like way up. So it really works. People value their food more because it costs more money and they waste less. But that doesn't really sound like a solution. So what do we do with this? Like, we know that to get people to value their food, you can tell them where it came from, you can, make it taste really good, but ultimately, like, it tends to just come down to price. So what's the policy solution here? Should food prices just stay high? I don't know. I'm really asking.
Yeah, I think in terms of addressing food waste, there's policy interventions that can happen across the food supply chain that are going to incrementally not only change the habit of consumers, but are also going to change the way that business is done. So, for example, Emily was talking a lot about organic waste bans from the landfill. Like, if we are disincentivized to send food into the landfill, then there are going to be new business opportunities for infrastructure, for upcycling of food, making new products from food that is otherwise going to be wasted, and new pathways for things like donation of high quality surplus food. With some of the bans that Emily was talking about, you do see an uptick in food donation, and that's like a really critical component of our food system. Similarly, I think there's other components of education of consumers. I mentioned food date labeling. We, NRDC, along with the Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic, ReFed, and the World Wildlife Fund came together to build a coalition called the Zero Food Waste Coalition, working at the federal and state level on various policy solutions. We're now over 220 members across all 50 states of people that are working across businesses, institutions, municipalities, states, many more entities to really solve this problem together. And so when you have an issue like food date labeling, all of us are acutely aware of going into our fridge and seeing the milk carton. One person in the household is definitely drinking that milk. The other person in the household is like, no way, it was best if used by yesterday. Spoiler alert, like a lot of those date labels aren't relevant to you as a consumer. And so what we want to do is make it so that there's standardization at the federal level about this issue, so you have a standardized date label, and then provide consumers with the tools that they need to understand really basic things that are leading to food waste, like the misunderstanding of a date label. Use your senses and properly maintain temperature control on your food. But what we're seeing working in coalition is that we can kind of tackle these issues together so that by the time that it's at the household, people are just more equipped to know how to handle their food.
So it's interesting you mentioned the date label issue because that's been we've been talking about a federal date label legislation for
11 years. And 5 days.
I was going to say since I started reporting on food, but since before that. So it just isn't happening. And as far as I know, I don't know that anybody's really opposing it. It just doesn't seem to get any traction. I know California now might be taking that step on their own. Are you guys optimistic that California likes to do things and then the rest of the country has to just catch up? I think it's cool.
Deena, can I just ask you, like, since we have you all here, why hasn't it passed?
Can I take that first? I'll go first. Okay, let me talk about California for a second, because I think it's super exciting. And yet, like, go California. I know Secretary Ross was out here. This maybe isn't like her wheelhouse, but they do amazing stuff, and it's great. California just was the first state they passed standard date labels. It was passed by both houses. It is sitting on the governor's desk. He has until September 30th to sign it. Anyone who's here right now or watching, like, it is not too late. Send letters. I think part of why it doesn't happen is there's a lack of education about how important this is. And I think it ties back to this national campaign that Maddie was just talking about and that Nana from EPA talked about, that there's a great moment now if we're about to roll out a bunch of consumer education about food waste, like, let's make these clear now, and then you can start telling people, when you see this language, it means smell your food, look at your food. If it looks and smells fine, it's totally fine. And for this food that has this other label, be more cautious, eat it before the date or throw it out when that happens. And so I think there's this like critical window. And it has been a really long time, but this Congress, for the first time since we started working on this issue, there's a lot more co-sponsors for the federal legislation. So in the House of Representatives, there are 41 co-sponsors on a bill to standardize date labels, bipartisan. There's only one sponsor in the Senate, so if you know any senators, let them know to jump on board. But I think it takes a while on these bigger issues, especially if you're trying to go through Congress, because there's a lot of other pressing things that they can't get done. I think this falls to the bottom of that list, but I feel optimistic. And I'll say one other thing from the global work we've been doing with Global Food Banking Network. We've now looked at the laws on food waste in 25 countries, and we're the only country that doesn't have a law standardizing date labels of 25. And that doesn't even include the whole EU, which also has standard across the entire EU. So we're really an outlier in like not taking action on this, but I I do feel like with California right now setting the stage, and they separately passed a resolution calling on Congress to do this too. So they're like, we're going to do it if you don't, but we also want you to do something too. So I think I don't know, I feel optimistic.
I'm going to echo that. I feel optimistic too. I think there's more like movement than there has been previously. And so please do talk about it if you are talking to people.
Great. I talk about it and make people feel bad about themselves all the time.
Yes.
You're a lunch monitor.
Changing consumer behavior.
I want to be a lunch monitor.
Great. So, one thing that we don't talk enough about, I think, when we talk about food waste is how unaffordable food is for so many people. And when we talk about, food waste, and sure, we can donate it instead of throwing it away. Well, that's not really a solution to people not being able to afford food. And I'm wondering what that solution is, and whether there's a solution for the lack of affordability of food that also helps reduce food waste.
Well, it's not just food that's expensive. That's the elastic part of people's budget. It's really the cost of housing, of childcare, the stagnant wages that's causing all of that. So I think, and I'm sure that over the course of this week, there are a lot of panels discussing, why food prices are rising. But I do think, it's the classic, we need to pay people more so that there's more disposable income for food, which is, again, that part of if you have an emergency that's going to take up, money that you don't have anyway, you're going to use less of your money for food. And it's just such a tragedy, especially in light of the federal data that came out 2 weeks ago that show that food insecurity is, of course, continuing to be on the rise. So the fact, just the horrendousness of having such a reality of food waste with food insecurity is, something we have to do better on.
Support your local unions, right? With Baltimore City, there's obviously a really high rate of food insecurity. I do think donated food goes a long way. Today, actually, there's the ribbon cutting at the first Enoch Pratt free market, which is our library system. And they partner with the Maryland Food Bank, and they are stocking it like a grocery store. So it's like your corner store, but it's absolutely free. You can go in, it's right on the bus station, and get whatever it is that you need, and it's fresh produce. It's also shelf-stable items. But, right now, in the short term, I do think that capturing that, donatable food and redistributing it in like a timely way where it's not going bad, where you have like the cold storage along the way to make sure that food stays good is a really viable solution. But then also for me, I think about city contracting, right? Like how can I support unionized workplaces through city contracting, or how can I support small local businesses and keep those city dollars local, supporting small composters instead of industrial composters. So, and that puts money back in people's pockets, right? And they can afford the food that is grown locally.
Great. Well, time's up, so thank you guys. And I didn't even get to ask you your worst food waste crime in the last week, because
It's climate
I'm interviewing
week, so
Sam Cass later, and I'm going to ask him. So thank you guys so much, and thank you, Keating, for having me.
Thank you, Deena.